Whether you're solving murders during breakfast, cracking cold cases on your commute, or playing amateur detective at bedtime, Amazon Music's got millions of podcast episodes waiting. Just download the Amazon Music app and start listening to your favorite true crime podcasts ad-free, included with Prime.
This podcast is sponsored by IQ Bar.
I've got good news and bad news. Here's the bad news. Most protein bars are packed with sugar and unpronounceable ingredients. The good news? There's a better option. I'm Will, and I created IQ Bar plant protein bars to empower doers like you with clean, delicious, low-sugar brain and body fuel. IQ Bars are packed with 12 grams of protein, brain nutrients like magnesium and lion's mane, and zero weird stuff. And right now, you can get 20% off all IQ Bar products, plus free shipping. Try our delicious IQ Bar sampler pack with 7 plant protein bars, 4 hydration mixes, and 4 enhanced coffee sticks. Clean ingredients, amazing taste, and you'll love how you feel. Refuel smarter, hydrate harder, caffeinate larger with IQ Bar.
Go to eatiqbar.com and enter code BAR20 to get 20% off all IQ Bar products plus free shipping. Again, go to eatiqbar.com and enter code BAR20.
The Murder Shelf Book Club contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Listener discretion is advised.
And so I pummeled my reeling brain, trying to force it to fit the pieces of the elusive pattern together. Meanwhile, the speakers took their turns around the table. I envisioned the killer as being well-proportioned, not fat and not skinny either. I almost had it. And trail of semen, one speaker was saying. That word trailed landed in my mind like a splash of ice water. I experienced a moment of confusion, followed by an almost shocking clarity. The ideas that had been milling about in my head suddenly fell into step. That pieces of the pattern abruptly arranged themselves and locked together. I had it. From the Case Book of a Criminal Psychiatrist by Dr. James Brussel, MD. Welcome to the Murder Shelf Book Club podcast. I am your host, Jill. This is part 3, second cast, episode 157, Laws of Sanity, the conclusion of my trilogy on Incendiary, the psychiatrist, the mad bomber, and the invention of criminal profiling. I highly, highly recommend listening to the first 2 parts, episode 152 and 154, before you listen to this one, with so many spoilers. I also hope that you have enjoyed my special episodes, my conversation with John Hinckley Jr., with author Leslie Rule, for the long-awaited huge update on her book, A Tangled Web, that confirmed many of our suspicions about that perpetrator, and the Lisk update by Joe Giacolone of True Crime with the Sarge. And Rex Heuermann was just back in court again, and we know the Lisk case will be huge in the fall of 2026. All right, so back to our final installment on this frustrating investigation and the hunt for the serial bomber, FP, also known in the newspapers as the Mad Bomber. In part 2, Oedipus Rising, frustration gives way to desperation, with Captain Howard Finney opting to consult a psychiatrist who might be able to give them something, anything helpful to find the Mad Bomber. So meet Dr. James Brussel, who examines the files and presents a profile of FP, staggering in his details. With the police skeptical of psychiatry, Dr. Brussel suggests that they release his profile, which might draw the bomber to emerge from the shadows to correct any errors that the doctor had made. And this, coupled with the Journal American newspapers printing secret messages to FP, and with him responding, that finally culminates in an arrest. And so we begin part 3 of Michael Cannell's book, Incendiary. I also drew greatly on the book written by Dr. James Brussel, Case Book of a Crime Psychiatrist, and I opened with a quote from his book. My full list of sources are on my blog at www.murdershelfbookclub.com, February 2026. So let us begin part 3, The Law of Insanity. NYPD bomb squad captain Howard Finney and 5 detectives arrived in Waterbury, Connecticut, from New York, trailed by reporters. Sitting in an interrogation room, Finney asks the smiling George Metesky, age 53, with round glasses and a receding chin, why had he done this? And he obliged, eager to share his story, appreciating the attention. Taking them back 26 years to that fateful day, September 5th, 1931, George Metesky arrived at work like any other day. As a Con Edison generator wiper, he always wore a suit and tie, presenting himself more as a middle manager than a blue-collar worker. Hell's Gate, the large 8-story red brick power plant covered in soot that occupied 2 city blocks, was his workstation. This plant supplied most of New York City's electricity, drawing millions of gallons of water and using coal-fired iron boilers to heat it, which in turn powered the steam that turned the enormous turbines connected to 2 of the largest generators in the world. Metesky was a lower-tiered worker, spending his days close to a red-hot furnace in an environment where the walls were flaking with asbestos, now known to cause lung cancer. Cement dust filled the air, and the masks that they wore offered little protection. By the end of each day, workers were coughing heavily. But jobs were scarce in 1931 due to the Great Depression, which had slowed the economy to a crawl. Taking this job, he's built upon the skills he had learned as an ordnance officer in the Marines. The son of Lithuanian immigrants, Metesky had picked up his parents' accent, and thus he often faced heckling and ridicule for taking jobs from real Americans. George was meticulous in his job performance. He read the meters on the generator boards to prevent overloads and ensured that electricity flowed smoothly across the city. His scrupulous manner made him popular with managers, but he often annoyed his coworkers who found him priggish. He avoided eye contact, didn't engage in the small talk that lightened the workday, and adhered strictly to procedure. This was his comfort zone. On September 5th, 1931, George went to work, unaware that one of the boilers was malfunctioning due to a soot buildup that was beginning to close off the passageways known as baffles. With 21 boilers in operation, George couldn't hear the hissing and straining sounds of the pressure building up until it erupted like a volcano just as he walked by. A cloud of toxic fumes engulfed him. He lurched backward, clutching his throat. The chemicals singed the capillaries of his lungs, causing blood to sputter up as he coughed violently, sounding more like hacking barks. He sank to the cold concrete floor. 2 of his coworkers, Kavanaugh and Casey, alerted by the blast, found George struggling to breathe and hacking up blood as he gasped, trying to explain what had happened. His boss was indifferent, though, as if George's injuries were a common sight. Now he sent George to load lumber, but George collapsed again, laying on the ground for hours. After his shift, he took the subway home, still hacking up blood. At his boarding house, weak and vomiting, he bled from his lungs. He was taken to the hospital but received little help and was finally sent to a sanitarium for painful tuberculosis treatments. Struggling financially, he wrote letters to Con Edison, seeking compensation. He did receive 80% of his salary for 26 weeks and a group insurance settlement of $58 a month. However, Con Edison ended their support and advised him to apply for workers' compensation disability, which would be $25 a week as long as he was disabled. But this ultimately led to a tragic dead end with devastating consequences. George's workman's comp application was rejected because he submitted it over a year after the statute of limitations had expired. He suspected that Con Ed had intentionally delayed the process, knowing he wouldn't be eligible by that date. Struggling financially, he left the sanitarium and returned home to Waterbury to live with his sisters. There, he became dependent on them, as he had been on their mother, often despairing with thoughts of death. Feeling hopeless, he reapplied to the Workers' Compensation Board 3 times, but was rejected each time. And his coworkers, Casey and Kavanaugh, they testified that he had a rag to his face due to a nosebleed, and one claimed he wasn't even at work the day of the explosion. Were they lying out of dislike for Metesky, pressured by management? Or was George delusional, imagining a worse accident than what really happened? Well, I don't know, but I was still upset for George. Something had clearly happened. Taking the subway into New York City, George recalled seeing Casey and Kavanaugh sitting across from him, and he couldn't believe it. And these men he saw, they were laughing at him. But I have to question, were they real or just a hallucination? I mean, what were the chances of him taking the subway and running into them? Quote, schizophrenics can suffer for years, enduring modest delusions and a slow unwinding of their wits. Their inner turbulence is often private and so hidden that it may be imperceptible to those around them. Then, without warning, they can experience a temporary outbreak of psychosis, a psychotic break, where they stumble into the black madness of hallucinations, disjointed flights of thought, and godly voices whispering in their heads. End quote. All the years of suffering and rage erupted in George, and he felt he had no choice but to seek vengeance against Con Edison and its allies across American society. With his paranoia laid bare, their conspiracy was aimed right at him and affecting other defenseless people as well. His was a righteous anger, a righteous violence. Bombs were a natural choice for George. Back in 1920, while he was attending Crosby High School, 10,000 mill workers went on strike, protesting wage cuts, and clashed with the police in Waterbury. That summer, an unexploded bomb was discovered outside the office of Police Superintendent George M. Beach. Remembering this incident, Metesky adopted bombs as his weapon. Captain Kinney asked him why he had stopped bombing during World War II. Well, as a former Marine, Metesky felt it would have been wrong. By now, Finney and the detectives were surprised by how openly George Metesky discussed how and why he became known as the Mad Bomber. And this behavior was consistent with Dr. Brussel's prediction that Metesky would become frustrated with his anonymity and want to have his story told. Now, I previously mentioned that Dr. Brussel speculated about FP's sexuality, suggesting that he had an Oedipal fixation on his mother. All right, so we probably laugh a little bit at this because it seems absurd in the 21st century. But Freudian psychiatry was very popular in the 1950s when this case is happening. Now, George was asked if he had any female friends and whether he liked women. Oh, he was interested in women, and he claimed to be having an ongoing affair with a socially well-known woman from Waterford. However, she was married, and this could lead to a scandal. She was unaware of the bombs, so there was really no need to involve her. Now, the detectives picked up that when George was saying this, there was a noticeable change in his demeanor. He became visibly anxious. It seemed he was either trying to protect his girlfriend or lying. Now suddenly he began coughing violently, revealing his illness for the first time. And I think this is what we call a tell. I think he's lying. I think it would be terribly humiliating for him at 53 to admit to being a virgin. All right, remember the film, The 40-Year-Old Virgin? Yeah, well, he's 53. As the interrogation continued, reporters gathered at 4th Street to see Metesky's house and try to interview the sisters. Anna Metesky, her eyes red from crying, insisted that George was innocent. He often spent hours in his garage, but as an inventor, he had patented an electric snowplow and a solenoid pump. While occasionally he would disappear for days to go visit their older brother John and his wife Gertrude in Hartford. Quote, "He just wasn't the type," end quote, Anna insisted. Sister May now stuck her head in the door, complaining that she was sick and the reporter should just go away. And now a reporter from the Naugatuck Daily News was calling Hartford to find brother John Metesky. Wife Gertrude answered the phone, crying, quote, "My God, they have the wrong man. It couldn't be George. I just don't believe it. He's a good, decent man." And John concurred. "His arrest is ridiculous and outrageous. We'll get the best lawyers in the country to defend him." End quote. At 6:30 a.m., reporters swarmed into the Waterbury police station, getting their first view of George Metesky as he came down the stairs. By 7 a.m., George was lying in his cell when Detective William Schmidt entered. They believed he was guilty, but still needed bomb components to confirm it. Schmidt asked George if there were more bombs at his house. With a little spark of mischief in his eyes, George replied, quote, "You didn't find them, did you?" End quote. And he began to explain. By 8 p.m. at the Metesky house, May and Anna were still in their nightgowns, still insisting that their brother was innocent. Detective Schmidt and the bomb squad were beginning their search. They loaded the metal lathe from the garage into the police vehicle, along with George's notebooks and a Remington typewriter. Its typeface matched that of the bomber's letters. Following the directions that Metesky had given Schmidt earlier, Detective John Justy laid down next to the pantry between the sink and the wall. Contorting himself, he reached into an opening there, and his fingertips brushed against something. Straining to stretch further, Justy gripped 4 wool red socks hanging from a water pipe. Carefully, he handed them to Schmidt, because each sock contained a pipe bomb, a Timex watch, batteries, and screws, all the components needed to create the bombs. They had him, there was no doubt. And these would have been his largest bombs yet, intended for use at the Coliseum. George Metesky stood before Judge Hugh McGill in a Waterbury City Court, looking like a professor in his suit and glasses. Judge McGill usually did not allow press into his courtroom, but this case was too significant, so the court was packed. Metesky waived his right to an extradition hearing and was charged with felonious assault, malicious mischief, and possession of a dangerous weapon in New York City. After the hearing, an overwhelmed May and Anna visited George in his cell and wept, "Is it true?" And George admitted that he was guilty. He also told a reporter that his arrest, quote, "was bound to happen," end quote, and that he might have turned himself in to the Journal American paper. Following this, he was loaded into the paddy wagon, headed for New York City. Metesky's perp walk revealed him looking tired but smiling, his chubby face reflecting giddy satisfaction as he reveled in the attention, earning the nickname the Smiling Avenger. New York City detectives wore larger smiles, however, as they endured his grandstanding. They knew that he would soon be taken to the hole. At a Manhattan court, George was formally charged, prompting speculation about his fate and a shift in the news coverage. The first hurdle was determining if George was competent to stand trial. He seemed to function normally, but his court-appointed lawyer, Benjamin Schumer, was uncertain if he understood the charges against him. Schumer requested a psychological evaluation, which Judge Reuben Levy approved, stating, quote, "The defendant's actions are indicative of an ostensibly deranged mind," end quote. As a result, George was sent to Bellevue Hospital for evaluation. I think we knew that was coming. While waiting for the evaluation results, Commissioner Kennedy promoted 23 officers to first-grade detectives for the capture of FP, leading to a debate over credit for the arrest versus who was to blame for it taking this long to arrest someone. The media, however, was focused on Alice Kelly, the Con Ed clerk who found Metesky's file, while Kennedy was opposed to giving any of the $26,000 reward offered by the NYPD and the Patrolmen's Benevolent Association to anyone at Con Ed. Kennedy's spokesman, Walter Arm, claimed that Detective Bertram Scott had discovered the file after learning that Con Ed had withheld pre-1940 files for years, despite their previously insisting that they had no such files. The battle was on. Con Ed insisted that they had cooperated fully and that any delays were due to vetting the files with their lawyers. In the end, the police were unable to prove that Con Ed had hidden the files, although I absolutely believe they did. Ultimately, Con Edison president Hartland C. Forbes and Commissioner Kennedy addressed the issue together. Kennedy acknowledged that Con Ed's account was correct, and they confirmed that Bertram Scott had found the file. The $26,000 reward was never awarded. Praise also landed on Journal American publisher Berkson for orchestrating, quote, "one of the great journalistic scoops of the past generation," end quote. And Berkson enjoyed telegrams of congratulations from FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, Governor Averell Harriman, and Mayor Robert Wagner. Berkson also kept his word to George Metesky. Bart J. O'Rourke, one of the city's best labor lawyers, took on the case pro bono and was hired by Berkson as the headlines continued to be printed. This also alleviated accusations that Berkson had used the Mad Bomber to sell papers, which of course he had. It's the story of the day. O'Rourke knew that rejecting Metesky's application, which had arrived 2 years late, was appropriate. But O'Rourke wondered, if Metesky was determined to be legally insane, would that legally excuse his filing late? And were the actions of Con Ed a widespread practice to cheat injured employees? Workmen's compensation only came into existence after the devastating 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York City, when 146 workers found locked exits, dying unable to escape the fire. It was this watershed moment that directly spurred the establishment of workers' compensation laws in New York. Following the public outrage, the state enacted reforms in 1913 and 14 that created the State Insurance Fund and the Workers' Compensation Board, shifting from a fault-based system to a no-fault system for industrial injuries. And George's injury only occurred 20 years later. Now, news stories also shifted to focus on some of the victims. Abraham Blumenthal, the postal worker whose left leg had been injured, he said, quote, "He had the whole city in a panic. Everyone was afraid. Now the city will be at peace again," end quote. January 26, 1957, Dr. Brussel appeared on the TV show Eye on New York, explaining that Metesky's paranoia was the result of unresolved psychosexual issues going back to his earliest years. Given the paranoia and the suspicion it spawns, Metesky would have been unable to trust the therapist, so there was likely no cure for him. The example Brussel shared was, you're walking down the street with him, and he says, quote, "I'm always being followed. Look, behind us, there's a man." And sure enough, you turn around and there's a man. Well, you can't argue the man away. He is there. He's real. The paranoiac is convinced the man has some sinister purpose. End quote. May and Anna Metesky now went to see James D.C. Murray, a kind-hearted, genteel, grandfatherly defense attorney with a mile-long success rate. He had defended the worst of the worst because he felt a deep empathy for those in trouble and felt that the law only worked for the wealthy. And now he agreed to defend George Metesky. He assessed his new client at Bellevue, a grim municipal asylum, a place of last resort. Wearing blue wool PJs and a bathrobe, George seemed to be the only one enjoying Bellevue, winning the title of checkers champion. Murray explained that New York State permits trials only if a panel of psychiatrists judge the defendant to be sane. If not, one would be committed to an asylum for the criminally insane. 3 psychiatrists from Bellevue evaluated George for weeks, characterizing him as, quote, alert, cooperative, and eager to please, end quote. George expressed intentions to kill the president of Con Edison and cause a citywide blackout, exhibiting a fervent zeal as he talked of his plots. Now, this evaluation extended into February 1957 due to the conflicting opinions among the psychiatrists. Meanwhile, defense attorney James Murray informed the press about George's mental instability. Quote, he has a delusion of grandeur and claims that he is the savior of a soulless corporation. His sisters shared that he'd watch a funeral on television and laugh like the Dickens. End quote. February 28th, Judge John A. Mueller, frustrated by the psychiatrist's inability to make a decision on Metesky's sanity, called for an immediate hearing. He demanded that Bellevue send a psychiatrist to present the report orally if a written report wasn't ready, and the scrambling began. Now Judge Mueller pressed psychiatrist Dr. Cassidy, who stated that the evaluation was incomplete. Not having it, Judge Mueller asked, quote, did he know that exploding a bomb was exploding a bomb, or did he think he was eating an apple pie? End quote. Cassidy agreed that George knew. Quote, do you think he knew that this was against the accepted rules of conduct in the society in which he lived? Now the psychiatrist was less confident. No, I don't think so. End quote. Judge Mueller demanded that Metesky enter a plea, leading to a disagreement as the defense attorney argued that this would be a miscarriage of justice. Undeterred, Judge Mueller entered a not guilty plea and ordered Metesky to stand trial. Dr. Cassidy was distressed, and Metesky was sent to the Manhattan House of Detention known as the Tombs, where he would be placed on 24/7 suicide watch. This ignited a legal battle between Judge Mueller and Anna Cross, the city commissioner of corrections, who sought Metesky's return to Bellevue for necessary psychiatric treatment. Ultimately, a second judge supported Cross, and Metesky was returned to Bellevue. While he was being transported back, a 16-page psychiatric report arrived at Judge Mueller's chambers, revealing that the 3 psychiatrists deemed Metesky a paranoid schizophrenic incapable of understanding the charges against him. On March 22nd, another confrontation occurred between defense attorney James Murray and Judge Mueller, who held a hastily convened hearing that ignored aspects of the law. As voices rose, Murray called on the judge to recuse himself for his blatant prejudice, but Judge Mueller refused to step down.
though he did agree to nullify the February 28th hearing and scheduled a new one, a decisive victory for the defense. But would Murray pay the price later for defying Judge Muller? Well, the new hearing came, and Dr. Albert Laverne, an associate professor of psychiatry at Fordham University, testified. Another heated exchange with the judge occurred over Dr. Laverne's use of psychiatric terminology, such as delusions. The judge said he preferred the word thoughts. Regardless, all three psychiatrists who examined Metesky testified that he should be in an asylum, not jail. Now, Mary requested that the court accept the psychiatric report, but Judge Muller vehemently shouted, quote, "Your motion is denied," end quote. And then he asked how Metesky was pleading. Well, Metesky himself was absent-mindedly rolling and re-rolling a piece of paper. He stood up and said, "Not guilty." And this marked the first time that a judge just disregarded an undisputed medical opinion, which is just plain injustice. This roller coaster ride continued on to April 6th, when George Metesky's dormant tuberculosis was found to be active again. Quarantined to prevent the infection from spreading, he coughed non-stop, growing weaker. Blood streamed from his nose and mouth as his heart raced, and his blood pressure was falling. George thought he was on his deathbed and submitted. When the medical staff discovered him, they asked him why he hadn't called for help. He said, quote, "It's no use living. I deserve to die," end quote. He was stabilized, but doctors warned that the stress of a trial would likely lead to a fatal hemorrhage while posing a severe public health risk. Unmoved, Judge Muller moved to impanel a jury. Meanwhile, Murray shifted his focus from avoiding a trial to saving George's life. George was also facing charges in Brooklyn, separate from the case against him in Manhattan, but the Brooklyn proceedings were on hold due to the Manhattan competency hearing. Shifting tactics, Murray now asked Brooklyn's Judge Leibowitz to fast-track his competency hearing, which could preempt Judge Muller's Manhattan trial. Metesky was now transported by ambulance to Brooklyn's King County Hospital, where a makeshift courtroom was set up within the prison wing. Equipped with an oxygen tank and IV, an ashen Metesky was wheeled in front of George Leibowitz, who warned everyone that he was highly contagious. Dr. Laverne now testified that Metesky was unable to participate in his defense and noted that, among all schizophrenics he had examined in his career, Metesky was one of the most dangerous to society due to the severity of his psychosis. Judge Leibowitz asked, quote, "If Mr. Murray was to consult with this man, would he be speaking to an insane man?" End quote. And Dr. Laverne agreed he would, explaining that Metesky believed that Murray was part of a vast conspiracy aimed at thwarting him from exposing Con Ed. If released, would he resume bombing? Undoubtedly, was the reply, as George coughed up blood and turned blue with medical staff aiding him. As a psychiatrist, Dr. Laverne was also a medical doctor. When considering how long George Metesky might live, Laverne stated that the antibiotics were not helping because 2/3 of his lung tissue was infected. And he remarked, quote, "No doctor can answer that, but he doesn't have much longer to go. I imagine it's a question of weeks," end quote. Given the circumstances, it did not make sense to keep a desperately ill man in court, risking the spread of infection. On April 18th, Judge Leibowitz rendered his verdict. George Metesky was deemed medically insane and was committed to the Matteawan State Hospital, an institution for the criminally insane located upstate. Murray's legal magic had derailed Judge Muller's hell-bent plan to hold a trial, no matter what. Judge Muller could actually bring Metesky down from Matteawan. However, in Judge Leibowitz's ruling, he included this, quote, "One would be less than human not to be sympathetically moved by this pitiful condition of this hopeless, incurable man, incurable both mentally and physically. His days on earth are numbered," end quote, repeating the exact phrase that George had written in his first letter to the American Journal. His days on earth are numbered. And there was serious concern that George would even survive to make the 70-mile trip to Matteawan.
Whether you're into unsolved mysteries, solved mysteries, or creating your own mysteries, Amazon Music's got millions of podcast episodes waiting. Just download the Amazon Music app and start listening to your favorite podcasts ad-free, included with Prime.
On receiving word of the order, Judge Mueller was furious, seeing it as proof that psychiatrists held too much power over the court, something that he was determined to change. Mueller consulted with Manhattan District Attorney Frank Hogan, who now called the superintendent of Matteawan, who explained that there was no way Metesky could return to Manhattan to stand trial. He had suffered significant weight loss, and he could barely walk to the bathroom. Another hemorrhage could likely be fatal for him, and he posed the risk of infecting everyone in the courtroom. But not letting this go, Judge Mueller made it clear that he wanted to be kept informed about Metesky's status. Matteawan, which looked like a large Gothic hotel, held criminally insane patients, and of these, 40% were murderers. Without defined trials, convictions, or sentences, they were released only upon death, which led to suicides. There, Metesky struggled to breathe on his deathbed and assuring a priest that he had, quote, made peace with the world, end quote. By Christmas, Metesky's tuberculosis was in remission, and he was moved to the psychiatric wing, which allowed him to walk around outside. Manhattan DA Frank Hogan periodically requested a new assessment of Metesky from Superintendent McNeil, who reported that while Metesky's physical health had improved, his mental condition remained unchanged, and McNeil could not recommend his release to Judge Leibowitz, who fortunately retained jurisdiction. 8 months later, workers' compensation rejected Bart O'Rourke's appeal, despite 3 psychiatrists deeming Metesky insane due to his schizophrenia. O'Rourke had lacked sufficient evidence, and that closed the door on any just settlement for George Metesky for good. "15 years later, Metesky was a model inmate. He diligently followed the hospital rules, which is no surprise to us. He thrived on the structure and the daily routine of Matteawan. He regularly wrote to his sisters, attended chapel, and listened to the radio. However, he refused to wear the striped prison uniform, insisting on his double-breasted suit. Quote, "I am not insane. I still feel justified in what I did," end quote. Well, Dr. Brussel had predicted that Metesky would never respond to treatment. And here we are 15 years later. On occasion, Dr. Brussel traveled to Matteawan to interview patients who had applied for a transfer to non-criminal mental hospitals. And once he met with George Metesky. George was calm, smiling, and condescending. Metesky shared his plan to be discharged, downplaying his bomb-making skills, claiming the bombs weren't all that powerful after all. And Brussel wrote, quote, "He didn't become angry. Instead, he remained the patronizing and successful paranoiac who, like God, could appreciate and magnanimously forgive his children's mistakes," end quote. After George Metesky was captured and sent to the mental hospital, interest in interviewing Dr. James Brussel waned. While his profile had not led directly to the bomber, it had provided essential information that ended New York's longest manhunt. By narrowing the search to a specific type of male, Brussel's insights drew attention to Metesky, just as he had predicted. Alice Kelly wouldn't have recognized the file without reading about the profile. Ultimately, Dr. Brussel helped authorities find Metesky, confirming his theory of reverse psychology right down to Metesky's buttoned double-breasted suit. George Metesky is a spree killer who fortunately did not succeed in killing anyone, although he did maim 47 people. Among mass killers, he fits the profile of the set-and-run killer. This is the type of spree killer who tends to escalate operating within their comfort zone. Initially, Metesky's bombs were not placed in high-traffic areas and lacked significant power. As he continued his attacks, he felt he wasn't getting enough attention for his cause and his mission, prompting him to escalate his efforts by using larger bombs and targeting busier locations, such as pedestrian thoroughfares, railroad terminals, concourses, museums, and theaters. He never ventured outside New York City, focusing solely on areas in Manhattan, Brooklyn, and the Bronx. Metesky was intimately familiar with these areas, including escape routes, which allowed him to blend in seamlessly. For 16 years, he managed to remain unidentified. As his attacks progressed, his obsession deepened, and his self-confidence grew. He began to take on a sense of deification, believing that God was supporting him. He was the harbinger of justice. The set-and-run killer has psychological issues, and we've heard Dr. Brussel's elaborate description of George's difficulties. Many of these spree killers will die, whether by suicide or suicide by cop. Thus, many bombers leave messages, whether journals or videos, a manifesto, explaining their reasoning or lack thereof. If you recall the case of serial bomber Mark Condit, age 23, for 3 weeks in March 2018, he set bombs mostly in Austin, Texas. 5 package bombs exploded, killing 2 people and injuring another 5. On March 21st, in Pflugerville, Texas, Condit was pulled over by police, detonating an explosion inside his vehicle, killing himself and injuring a police officer. Another serial bomber is Eric Rudolph, who bombed an abortion clinic and the Atlanta Olympics, which was covered in great detail and compassion on Zone 7 with Cheryl McCollum, who was on the job when this tragic event occurred. And of course, there's serial bomber Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, who mailed 10 bombs across the United States, killing 3 and injuring 23. George Metesky, he mailed letters to the press, as we saw. So he really is typical of the set-and-run spree killers, and he certainly had a desire to kill. Remember, he was caught with his 4 largest bombs, intending to explode them in the crowded Coliseum, a venue that would have thousands of visitors. If you want to know more about spree killers, there is a book. Of course there's a book. Spree Killers, Practical Classifications for Law Enforcement and Criminology by Mark Safaric, retired FBI agent, and Dr. Catherine Ramsland. Catherine and I also discussed some of this when she was my guest in episode 117. So, doing research for this case, I read Dr. Kirk Yeager's paper, the chief explosive scientist at the FBI lab at Quantico, titled Understanding Bombers' Motivations, a Historical Study. And yes, I did link this to my blog as well. And I love Dr. Yeager's observations. He identified 3 factors that explain the motivation of bombers: power disparity, malice as in evil intent and anger, and mental illness. None of these factors are exclusive, with individual bombers' reasoning often overlapping. So, power disparity. This is the most common motivation by far, and it's exactly what you think. Bombers believe that they are under threat in a manner that puts their very identity at risk. The closer to the issue the bomber is, the greater chance of instigating violent acts. This can include oppression of religious ideals, ethnicity, a lack of hope for the situation improving, with an adversary that is far more powerful and influential. Quote, anarchists refer to dynamite as the great equalizer because of its ability to empower a person against a daunting foe, be it a governmental or industrial power, end quote. So I mentioned anarchism in my first episode when I talked about the bomb being placed outside the bank on Wall Street in 1920. There's a great example of power disparity. Malice. This is the most subjective of the categories, and it's tough to take the malice out of power and mental illness. However, alone, malice refers to, quote, a desire to cause pain, injury, and distress to another, end quote. So this is the fabric of bombers who hold personal grudges. And who does that sound like? And then mental illness. The National Institute of Mental Illness defines it as a mental, behavioral, or emotional disorder that can seriously impair function as a human being. For bombing motivation purposes, mental illness is akin to the legal defense of insanity, where a person lacks capacity to discern between right and wrong. Mental illness alone is rarely a solo motivation for bombers. So we see in George, he's having delusions and he's paranoid, but it was the personal grudge against Con Ed that fueled his contempt and desire for vengeance until justice was done. And Dr. Yeager specifically addresses George Metesky, our perpetrator, quote, as the perfect overlap of a struggle with power disparity and mental illness. George Metesky suffered a debilitating work injury. The denial of workers' compensation for the injury, along with his innate mental instability, led him on a 17-year bombing campaign in New York City that spanned the 1940s and 50s. Metesky's bombings were unique in that they were not conducted to further a political agenda, but a personal one, end quote. So we can see how the expert on serial bombers views Metesky, and I agree. Now, what happened to Dr. Brussel? So he lost his wife Audrey to a heart ailment. Later in 1957, he married a widow named Audrey and moved into her Greenwich Village apartment. And although he was Jewish, he celebrated Christmas 1957 with her children, John and Judy Israel, as he and Audrey made plans to go on vacation in Jamaica. Now, rising and reading the newspaper, Dr. Brussel read about the violent stabbing of 44-year-old Mary Nerich, who was attacked after returning home from a Christmas party. While walking to the house she shared with her siblings, she was fatally stabbed multiple times. Readying to leave for Jamaica, the phone rang. It was the brassy voice of homicide detective Captain McCarthy, who had been referred by Captain Howard Finney. McCarthy had a case that was proving difficult for the department. They just had no leads. It was the case of the murder of Mary Nerich. She had no known enemies, and the evidence was confusing. Brussel asked why. Well, she had been stabbed through her coat with a penknife or small blade. Her driver's license and $45 had been stolen from her purse. Using her lipstick, the attacker had written, "Fuck Mary," on the side of her purse, as well as on a nearby house before discarding the bag and disappearing into the darkness. The community was twitchy and anxious. Could Dr. Brussel help? Agreeing, Brussel began to delve into the mind of a killer as McCarthy waited holding his breath. After a pause, Brussel spoke. Quote, "This is a skinny kid, not taller than 5'3" or 1.6 meters, and weighing 120 pounds or 54 kilos. He's punny and unattractive with acne. He feels unloved, angry, and may be suffering from schizophrenia. He lives near the street where the victim was found. He's a loner who spends his time at home with his mother if she's still alive. He watches TV and reads comic books. If he's in high school, he's barely passing and is on the verge of flunking out." End quote. And with that, Dr. Brussel and Audrey went to Jamaica. January 4th, 1958. Getting up and having his coffee and reading the newspaper that morning, Dr. Brussel read that they had caught the killer of Mrs. Mary Nurich, 16-year-old Warren Yeager, who lived near the victim, as Brussel had predicted. A sallow, withdrawn kid with a D average, he had a bad case of acne. Brussel had solved the crime without even visiting the crime scene, just talking on the phone. Warren Yeager would be tried and was convicted of Mary Nurich's murder, with the trial jury recommending he be shown mercy and spared the electric chair. He was sentenced to life in prison in 1958. But evidently, Warren Yeager was paroled. On December 25th, 1981, a 40-year-old man named Warren Yeager was arrested in the stabbing death of a trans woman sex worker, Terry Wilson, in Queens, and realized this murder, 30-something years later, is taking place at the same time as Mary Nurich was murdered. Now, in September 1963, the police again called upon Dr. Brussel. A gruesome double murder had occurred at the end of August. The young women were ages 21 and 23 and had just graduated from college. The two had been stabbed 60 times with a kitchen knife and the jagged edge of a soda bottle in their East Side apartment. A third roommate came home from work and found the young women on the bedroom floor, bound together with strips of sheets. One was naked, her body eviscerated. The scene was so upsetting, one of the detectives couldn't eat dinner. Taking in this information, Brussel set to work, peeling back the mystery of the murderer. Then he spoke. He stated that the killer was schizophrenic, similar to Metesky. He likely knew the girls from parties or work, although they may not have recognized him. The suspect was a young man, under age 35, employed in an advertising or at a creative agency. He was well-built and neatly dressed. In late April, a detective called to inform Brussel that they had apprehended a suspect who had confessed to the crime. Well, this news surprised Brussel. He had imagined that the killer would never confess. This killer exhibited traits of a lust killer, though Brussel didn't use that terminology. Secretive, the killer wouldn't want to share details of his deeds with anyone. So Dr. Brussel asked the detective to describe the suspect. The detective said it was George Whitmore Jr., a 19-year-old black man living in Brooklyn. He was described as childish, borderline intellectually disabled, messy, and barely literate. His prior arrest had been loitering in a laundromat. The evidence against him was weak. His wallet contained a photograph of a white girl who resembled one of the victims. Brussel told him, quote, "He isn't your man, confession or no confession," end quote. Within weeks, the case against Whitmore fell apart. It is significant that these murders occurred on the very day that Dr. Martin Luther King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Racial tension and activism were rife, with the NAACP and American Civil Liberties Union coming to Whitmore's defense. He had never been read his rights, he was not given access to an attorney, and the case was finally dropped. But the public pressure to solve the case remained high, leading the police to arrest Richard Robles, a frail heroin addict who was ultimately convicted of first-degree murder. However, Dr. Brussel did not believe that Robles was the actual perpetrator. Instead, a suspect who did match the profiles was a flamboyant young magazine writer who had left fingerprints in the girl's mailbox. After the murders, he suspiciously and abruptly moved to Europe. But despite this, the case was officially closed, though Brussel kept it alive in his thoughts. After he refused to endorse the arrest of Robles, the NYPD stopped consulting with him. Nevertheless, other agencies outside of New York City continued to seek out his expertise. In February 1964, while vacationing in Malindi, a beach resort north of Mombasa, Kenya, Dr. Brussel received a cable from John S. Bottomley, the Assistant Attorney General of Massachusetts. The message asked if he would like to join a task force of forensic psychiatrists, medical examiners, and others to discuss a series of murders committed by a killer known as the Boston Strangler. Brussel's response was, quote, taking the next subway out of Africa, end quote. Beginning in January 1962, 11 women were strangled in Boston. They had been molested and choked with their own clothing, and there was no sign of forced entry, indicating that they had willingly allowed their killer into their home. The community was terrified with the Boston Strangler on the loose. This serial killer was one of the earliest to gain widespread attention on television news across the country, much like the Zodiac killer's spree across California. Sales of handguns and enrollment in self-defense classes soared as residents cautiously opened their doors. And meanwhile, the Boston Police Department was utterly clueless. So on April 10, 1964, Dr. James Brussel flew north to join this gathering of experts. John S. Bottomley hoped that Brussel could replicate his success from the Mad Bomber case. The group was provided with all the available information, including crime scene photos and images of the victims. Among the women, 5 appeared grandmotherly, while the other 6 were younger and very attractive. They had been staged in, quote, grotesque postures with legs splayed apart and stockings, bras, and belts cinched around their necks and neatly tied with a bow, end quote. Dr. Brussel would write, quote, the photographs haunted my imagination, end quote. For 3 weeks, he contemplated trying to find some pattern to gain insight into murder, death, and sex intermingled in these murders. Discussing the insights presented by this elite panel of experts, they were concluding that there must be 2, possibly 3 or 4 stranglers involved. Unconsciously, Dr. Brussel grunted in disagreement, prompting all heads to turn and look at him. And in that moment, the pattern clicked in his mind. He began explaining that there was actually one strangler who had experienced, quote, instant maturity. In this 2-year period, he has suddenly gone psychosexually from infant to puberty to manhood. He committed these murders because it was the only way he knew to solve his problems, to find himself sexually and become a grown man among men, end quote. The first 5 victims were older, grandmotherly women possessing a maternal presence. By killing the 5 older women, he had exhausted his anger at his mother, getting over the infantile Oedipus fixation. None of these women showed any sign of coitus, and there was no semen found in or on the bodies. Instead, the perpetrator had penetrated them with fingers or with blunt objects taken from their apartments, as if curious, boy-like. He lacked the courage to have actual sexual relations with these maternal substitutes. He punished them, possibly for withholding their love and affection, and he vented his frustrations on these maternal stand-ins. After a 4-month hiatus, he then began attacking younger women. So over time, his sexual attention shifts to women closer to his age. But he's still in psychological puberty, needing to mature further. And this is a common schizophrenic vacillation. He desired them, but was compelled to harm them. He bit them. He stuffed their underwear in their mouths. He doesn't manage full intercourse until after the 2nd or 3rd of this younger group. His last victim was 19-year-old Mary Sullivan, who had evidence of semen in her mouth, the final complete indignity inflicted on her. And he left a greeting card at her feet, mocking her, which read, Happy New Year. And Brussel continued, the Boston Strangler likely knocks on their doors, presenting a plausible story, and given the fear that permeated Boston at this time, it had to be a really good story. He is charming, persuasive, and unthreatening. He's an average man who walks invisibly through the neighborhoods unnoticed. He is clean-shaven, dresses neatly, trying to be attractive to women, with a full mane of hair, and it is unlikely he's married. His victims were strangled quickly, going unconscious, meaning he is an athletic, well-proportioned man in his late 20s or 30s. Strangling is the common method of murder in Southern Europe, so the killer was Italian or Spanish descent. Quote, "One more thing. I don't think he'll be caught by ordinary detection. He will be found eventually, but this will happen because he has voluntarily told his story. You see, I think he is finished." End quote. Brussels went on to explain, quote, "He's been seeking to grow up sexually and to avenge himself for his mother's rejection of him. I believe he has succeeded on both counts. From now on, he will get his sexual satisfaction from conscious women in a more or less normal fashion. He may want to tell of his success, even if he only talks to one other person. Now that he's made himself mature, he wants people to know." End quote. Now, the advisory committee listened to this and rejected Brussels' psychological autopsy of the Boston Strangler. Moving from summer into the fall of 1964, there were no more stranglings, sparking much speculation about why. And then, at 9:30 a.m. on October 27, 1964, a newlywed female Cambridge co-ed was dozing in bed after her husband left for work. She awoke with a man standing at her bedroom door who moved, pressing a knife to her throat. Quote, "Don't make a sound or I'll kill you." End quote. He tied her up, stuffing her panties into her mouth. He kissed and fondled her and then fled abruptly, muttering, "I'm sorry," on his way out. After being rescued, the victim described her attacker to a police artist. He had slicked back dark hair, dark eyes, and a prominent nose. A Cambridge detective recognized the sketch as depicting Albert DeSalvo, 33 years old, a notorious sex offender. DeSalvo was a burly handyman and a former Army middleweight boxer who spoke gently and had a magnificent head of wavy dark hair. He fit Dr. Brussels' profile, being strong, athletic, and of Italian descent. But DeSalvo was married. Burglar and conman, DeSalvo managed to gain access to the apartments of dozens of women by being charming and persuasive. Although he had been questioned by police, he was released on bail. Later, he was arrested for unrelated sexual assaults and committed to Bridgewater State Psychiatric Hospital, a facility for the criminally insane. While there, he confessed to killing 11 women during a conversation with his defense attorney, F. Lee Bailey, who said, quote, "He'd reached a point where he was bursting to talk," end quote, as Dr. Brussel predicted. The confession was not admissible in court, and Albert DeSalvo was never tried for 13 murders. In 1967, he was sentenced to life in prison for robbery and the separate series of sexual assaults. The first witness at his trial was Dr. James Brussel, who had interviewed DeSalvo twice while he was in prison, serving as a defense witness, despite having previously worked with the police. F. Lee Bailey explained that Brussel knew more about the case than anybody else. Speaking with DeSalvo, Brussel saw a nice-looking average man who was surprisingly happy to meet him, having heard that he was the psychiatrist who best understood the Boston Strangler. Albert DeSalvo told Brussel he was confused by his own motives, and Brussel soon concluded that DeSalvo had missed his calling as a salesman. He would have been very successful. No wonder women had opened the door to him. DeSalvo described his childhood as a small hell. His father was horribly cruel to his wife and children, on one occasion breaking all his mother's fingers. Now, his mother did not defend the children. She was indifferent, leaving the house most nights. Quote, "There was no home life. She didn't stop the nightly beatings. This neglect, which spawned the emotional trauma of maternal rejection, eventually became part of the launching mechanism for Albert's stranglings." End quote. his anger had begun as a small child. One time, Albert almost strangled his only friend, Billy. While DeSalvo was in the army, he met a young German woman, and they married. In her, he had found the love he had wanted all his life but never had. Only she didn't like army life. A civilian once more, life got more difficult, and Albert was compelled to have his wife prove her love to him, having sex 2 to 3 times a day, sometimes leaving her exhausted, and by now they had 2 small children, one born with a deformity. This abnormal, intense need for his wife began to push her away, and soon she rejected him completely, this rejection mirroring what he felt as a child, and the murders began soon afterwards, followed by the sexual assaults. Quote, Albert had corroborated most of my guesses about him. He had murdered out of revenge and a sexual need going back to his boyhood. This regression to childhood had been precipitated, something I hadn't guessed, by his wife's rejecting him. End quote. Albert DeSalvo was stabbed to death while in prison in 1973. In 2013, DNA testing confirmed that the semen found in the body of Mary Sullivan matched DeSalvo's DNA. By the 1970s, Dr. James Brussel was known as the father of the emerging field of criminal profiling. He observed, quote, at the time, I was almost sorry I had been so successful in describing George Metesky, for I had to live up to that success. It wasn't always easy, and sometimes it was impossible. There were times when I made mistakes. There were times when I simply lacked enough information to build an image of the criminal. End quote. In his latter years, he built a successful profiling business, collaborating with police departments worldwide. He authored 8 books, including the one I love, Case Book of a Crime Psychiatrist, which caught the attention of young FBI agent Howard Tetton. Tetton learned from Dr. Brussel, combining psychological theory, deductive reasoning, and intuition in this work. Howard Tetton later founded the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit at Quantico, assisting law enforcement with about 5,000 murder cases annually by analyzing crime scene evidence and behavioral patterns. By the 1980s, a vast collection of crime data, forensic analysis, crime scene photographs, and other information had been compiled and used to develop profiles to assist with challenging investigations. As serial killing and various forms of violence increased, so did the use of these profiles. However, questions about their validity persist, and modern profilers acknowledge the limitations of their methods. Quote, profiling isn't magic, and it isn't a certainty. It's probability. Behavioral analysis doesn't solve crimes, but it helps investigators focus their efforts where the odds are the highest. End quote. Retired FBI profiler Julia Cowley told me. You know Julia. She is the host of the Consult Real FBI Profilers podcast, and I urge you to check her out if you have not already. I just love Julia. She is a dear friend. So what happened to George Metesky? Well, George's health not only remained stable, but also improved over time. However, as his health improved, his anger increased due to his ongoing confinement at Matteawan. He believed that the politicians were conspiring to keep him in the psychiatric hospital, so he decided to write to District Attorney Frank Hogan. Quote, it is indeed a shameful situation where people who are badly in need of correction themselves are busily pointing a finger at me with their own slimy hands. End quote. George wrote to judges, prosecutors, and his lawyer, feeling abandoned by everyone. With a spotless record, he remained at Matteawan, never having been tried or convicted, claiming that his incarceration violated his civil liberties. A judge requested a psychiatric evaluation, and the psychiatrist deemed him mentally impaired, resulting in George's petition being dismissed. Nevertheless, he continued to write, and became very knowledgeable in legal matters. In 1966 and again in 1970, Metesky, with a new attorney, secured a hearing in Poughkeepsie, asserting that he was sane enough to stand trial. Despite his claims of being of sound mind, psychiatrists from Matteawan testified that he still showed emotional outbursts, delusional ideas, and impaired judgment, leading to the dismissal of these petitions as well. However, civil rights activism in the late 1960s led to reforms in the 1970s due to shifting judicial perspectives. Courts began ruling that hospitals for the criminally insane could not indefinitely hold patients without due process, and that courts must acknowledge the constitutional rights even of the criminally insane. In 1971, attorney Kristen Booth Glenn filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of Metesky and other Matteawan patients for alleged violations of their civil and constitutional rights. The federal court in New York agreed, and a year later, the Supreme Court ruled that juries were necessary to determine if defendants were too mentally ill to stand trial and on issues of commitment. As a result, Metesky and 275 other patients were transferred from Matteawan to facilities run by health officials rather than correction institutions, with Metesky ending up at Creedmoor under Dr. Brussel's care. Unbelievable. After 17 years, the Department of Mental Health declared George Metesky fit for discharge, subject to regular outpatient visits to a local clinic. However, the charges against him for his actions as the Mad Bomber remained. A new law enacted in 1971 stipulated that inmates held at a facility for the criminally insane could be eligible for release after serving 2/3 of the maximum sentence they could have received at trial. George Metesky's maximum possible sentence was 25 years, which means that 2/3 of that time was 16 years and 8 months. Therefore, on December 12, 1973, the 47-count indictment against George was dismissed. The judge said, quote, "Many of us had sleepless nights because of the terror you were causing. I expect there will be no repetition." Metesky replied, "I think the judge is right. There won't be any repetition." End quote. Now George got on a Greyhound bus, headed home to Waterbury. He saw his familiar home, the porch still sagging on 4th Street, and rang the bell. Anna had already passed away, and his sister May answered the door. "Hello, George." George settled into his old routine, living quietly and listening to 1940s radio in the parlor. He enjoyed reading historical fiction and doing crossword puzzles. His favorite show on TV? The FBI, which aired from 1965 to 1974. Every Sunday, he attended Mass at St. Patrick's Church, using a cane for support. Although he had faded from public attention, George was investigated every time a serial killer emerged, whether it was the Son of Sam or the Unabomber. After a bomb killed 11 people at the TWA terminal in LaGuardia Airport in 1975, he urged the perpetrator to surrender, stating, quote, "They never stop coming after you," end quote. George Metesky passed away at the age of 90 in 1994 and was buried next to his sisters. And that concludes my trilogy on Incendiary, the Psychiatrist, the Mad Bomber, and the Invention of Criminal Profiling by Michael Cannell, with support from the book by Dr. Brussels, Casebook of the Crime Psychiatrist. This case is so important because it foreshadows so many cases that we've heard about and read about and still is relevant. I encourage you to read Michael Cannell's book because, as usual, there's so much more that I didn't get a chance to share. Cannell spent 3 years researching this case, and if you can find Dr. Brussels' book, I also recommend it. I found mine at a garage sale. True story. I think it cost me 50 cents or $1. So keep your eyes open. Now, the time has come to announce our next book. Thank you, my Patreon murder bookies. It is While She Slept by Marion Collins. Men and women meet. They fall in love, and then life happens. Relationships fray, divorces happen. We see this every day. However, as people who follow true crime, we know that not every failing relationship follows the normal path. This is that story. Divorce is being explored, tension rising, and then a horrible beating occurs, throwing families into chaos, panic, fear, and anger. Recovery from a head wound is fraught. 2 steps forward and 2 or 3 steps back, as the wheels of justice turn slowly, but long enough for a horrifying event that ends in a shocking murder. Read with me, or let me read for you, as we delve into the incredible book by Marion Collins, While She Slept. And I would love your help. If you enjoy my podcast, please take a moment to leave a glowing 5-star review wherever you listen. Your support is crucial in attracting more murder bookies. And if my podcast brings you joy or entertainment or passes a few hours not in boredom, I'd be incredibly grateful if you would share that review. Your time and your attention means the world to me. Join me on Patreon at www.patreon.com/MurderShelfBookClub for our monthly Zoom and our serial killer class on the first Thursday of the month. You can also find me on X, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and LinkedIn. All of my sources are on my blog at www.murdershelfbookclub.com with tons of pictures and news articles. Question: have you heard enough about the Boston Strangler, or should I do a trilogy on this case? Email me at jill@murdershelfbookclub.com. Thank you for being part of this journey. I see you as you hear me. Written and produced by Jill, all rights reserved. Music, The Pewter Elephant by Blue Dot Sessions.